Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 6 of Give Me Liberty. This chapter is called The Revolution Within, and basically what we're going to focus on is the inspiration that spread throughout the nation to different groups of people who were experiencing oppression during this time. So they used this American Revolution, the war that we were talking about last week, in order to attach the same language to the struggles that they were fighting themselves. So many different groups of people were inspired by this, including people in different countries around the world. And within this new country of the United States, specifically women, Native Americans, and African Americans were all left out of this newfound freedom that was found following the Revolutionary War. And these are the groups who ended up attaching this similar cry for freedom and cry for liberty to their own cause. Most who benefited from the American Revolution were free white males. The voting and property restrictions were often taken down for many people throughout the states at this point. And most of those people were free white men. So we should celebrate the fact that rights were expanded to different socioeconomic classes, even if it certainly wasn't expanded as far as we would like it to be. What is sort of confounding for many people who study this time frame is that there seems to be no contradiction between oppression and those at the top, their own quest for freedom. You hear a lot of language about liberty and freedom and it being a universal concept, but it certainly was not being universally applied in most cases. With all of this in mind, people were hoping to establish new governments within these particular states. At this point, there was no federal constitution. What you did have was individual state constitutions. With this, you had this sort of sense of togetherness in that they all were coming to the same table, basically. They were all tied to each other in a very loose way, and that they were creating their own country on the other side of the ocean from England. What was different were the particulars that they put in their own state constitutions. So one thing that they did have in common, though, was this idea that there would be no further interest in monarchy. They would set up their own governments so that the consent of the governed is required. What that means is that people needed to vote for who would be making the decisions at the top. What most of them also focused on was the idea of a balanced government. This meant that there would be multiple parts within the government that would provide those notorious checks and balances that we always hear about. They were hoping that if there were multiple groupings within the government, that one could not run away with all of the power and become more like a monarchy. And we would often think about this as becoming a dictatorship these days if the different parts of the government were stripped of their power. Voting laws varied by state, as did many different laws as they do today. But the voting laws were different in that they were often based on finances, certainly based on race, and certainly based on biological sex. And in some states, you still needed to be a landowner in order to cast a vote. Following the revolution, some states did decide to change this policy and allowed different people from different socioeconomic statuses to vote. Vermont was the only state that completely separated money from the right to vote at this point. And they're actually the first ones to outlaw slavery as well, and they wrote it into their original state constitution. So Vermont's always been a little, or let's say a lot, left of center, and that started pretty much at the beginning. One thing that we will do on the next slide is go over the Massachusetts State Constitution preamble. This is the beginning part of the Constitution. It is required by the state that we at least go over part of the Constitution with you in a history class so that you're somewhat aware of the language that's written into the laws that you're following while you're attending school here. So far as the Massachusetts State Constitution goes, the preamble is not particularly long, just like it's not in most of the constitutions. And we'll just read it and we'll stop on these highlighted parts so that you can get a better sense of what is being said. Remember, this was written in the 1700s. It's not updated necessarily. Often we do get amendments to the state constitutions, and we also get amendments to the federal constitution. So we'll just dig right in. The end of the institution, maintenance, and administration of government is to secure the existence of the body politic, to protect it, and to furnish the individuals who compose it, meaning the people of the state, with the power of enjoying in safety and tranquility their natural rights. So they're saying that there are these inborn rights. This sort of comes from the common rights of the Englishman, and that those who are making up this state and then choosing the government that runs this state should be able to enjoy these natural rights that we'll talk about in the final sentence of this first piece. So, enjoying in the safety and tranquility their natural rights and the blessings of life. And whenever these great objects are not obtained, the people have a right to alter the government. What this is saying is that you can change the laws accordingly if they're no longer fit to serve those who make up the body politic or the people living within the state, and to take measures necessary for their safety, prosperity, and happiness. Safety, prosperity, and happiness are what they're referring to previously as their natural rights. The body politic is formed by a voluntary association of individuals. They go on to explain this in the next part of the sentence, but please note the word voluntary. It is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen and each citizen with the whole people, that all shall be governed by certain laws for the common good. So the idea is that if you're living in the state, you're opting into the laws that are created for the greater good. It's not voluntary whether or not you follow the laws written into the Constitution or written into the court system. What is voluntary is you being a part of that society. It is the duty of the people, therefore, in framing a constitution of government, to provide an equitable mode of making laws, as well as for an impartial interpretation and a faithful execution of them, that every man may at all times find his security in them. One thing that we often will note applies much more in 2019 than it did in the 1700s is that this term, every man, was not particularly universal at this point. It often did refer to men, and it often referred to a particular class of men, being white men of a particular stature. This was written relatively vague, so we've been able to interpret this as time goes on without necessarily having to change this in the way that we would be able to based on the previous paragraph. We, therefore, the people of Massachusetts, acknowledging with grateful hearts the goodness of the great legislator of the universe in affording us, in the course of his providence, an opportunity deliberately and peaceably, without fraud, violence, or surprise, of entering into an original, explicit, and solemn compact with each other, and of forming a new constitution of civil government for ourselves and posterity, and devoutly imploring his direction in so interesting a design, do agree upon, ordain, and establish the following Declaration of Rights and Frame of Government as the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So what you'll note here, what's highlighted at the beginning of the paragraph and happens throughout the rest of the paragraph, is that there's this reference to the great legislator of the universe, meaning a God figure. And particularly in this situation, we know that they're referencing a Judeo-Christian God. Most of those in government were Protestant at this point. There was still some discrimination against Catholics, and there was still discrimination against Jews. Most of the people within the government were indeed Protestant. And the language being intertwined with religiosity and the laws that were being laid out for the state, the structure of the state, were not particularly controversial at this point. The concept of atheism and agnosticism, or even religions other than Christianity, was not particularly popular. So there wasn't a lot of outcry at including this within the founding legal documents. So you could go on to read the rest of the state constitution if you wanted to. I'll provide a link for you. It obviously gets quite long because things needed to be detailed eventually, and the laws are quite complicated. But the preamble gives you the idealistic version of the hope that people had when they were setting up these new governments in this time frame. Religion, like we just ended up talking about at the end of the preamble there, was a popular topic at the time. Most people subscribed to one religion or another, and most Protestant at this point. Anti-Catholicism had, while it still existed, it had sort of weakened at this point because the French, who were often Catholic, had helped the Americans to win the war against Britain, the Revolutionary War. And they were the main grouping of Catholics within the United States at this point. You'd see Irish immigrants coming in later and Italian immigrants coming in later, but the French were the most numerous Catholic population while all of these state constitutions were being written up. Enlightenment had changed the way that people thought about religion. The benevolent creator, or this omnipotent God, was still a belief, but there was less of a focus on him being involved in people's daily lives. People were thinking about this as more of a moral imperative rather than a supernatural force. And this was sort of a change in the way that people had been thinking about things. People had often thought that you could be smited at any given time had you made any sort of mistake that was forbidden by the Bible. But they were turning more towards looking at the Bible and at religion as a way to structure your behavior within a particular society. Well, the language within these constitutions sounds particularly religious to our modern day ear, the separation of church and state was actually coming up as an issue. One of the issues was the state funding of churches. People objected to the fact that states were funding particular churches because it showed favoritism of one religion over the other, and many people were still attached to this idea that there would be religious freedom in this new country. We know even today that most religious institutions do not pay taxes on the buildings that they have and that sort of thing. So there is still some state benefit for being a religious institution. Christian republicanism is a phrase that will keep coming up over the next few weeks. And this is the idea that there would be a need for religion or government to decide morality. And the implication is that the government would be influenced by religion to decide morality. Personal virtue is at the center of a balanced society, and revolution is divinely sanctioned. So this is suggesting that the creation of this new country, the United States, was divinely sanctioned, and that they were meant to break off and create this moral society that was based on religion and the rule of government. There were many economic concerns with separating from the European motherland. So by separating from England and attempting to create this new society, you could see many realms of economic downturn. So what happened, part of this in being inspired by the revolution, was that workers demanded rights. Workers started demanding that they be treated fairly, and women started to voice their concerns about their own employment. Wages were the biggest concern for people, as they tended to be incredibly low. Unless you were in the upper echelons of the socioeconomic strata, you would not be comfortable by most standards. While people were beginning to stage strikes and request higher wages and have all these sort of mini revolutions, enslaved Black Africans had their concerns completely set aside at this point. Indentured servants were no longer in use, but paying wages to Black workers was still not on the table. Of course, this depended on which state you were living in. As I mentioned, Vermont had outlawed slavery within their state constitution, so then they would be paying wages for anybody who lived there. But they'd already been operating under this essential freedom for what few Black people lived in Vermont at that point. The North and the South started to show these really stark divisions in their economic functionality. The North went with this concept of free labor, which did not mean that people were doing it for free, and it didn't mean that they had a ton of choice in what they were doing. They often did what was available, even if it was for low wages. What it means is that they were working for wages, or they owned that particular thing. So they either owned the business, they owned their own farm, something like that, or they were working for somebody else and taking money home. In the South, the major economic underpinning continued to be slave labor. So they were still working within the slave society in the southern states. One thing that has been a perpetual argument is this idea of a free market versus a regulated market. I'm quoting Foner on these because I think he sums things up nicely, that a regulated market is the traditional view that interests of the community took precedence over the property rights of individuals. So what this is saying is that particular laws are instituted within the market, curtailing the market in some cases, in order to provide a fair shot for people participating in the economic structure. The free market approach refers to an unregulated economic freedom that would produce social harmony and public gain. So the idea here is that without regulations, people would step up to do the right thing. The idea is that they would feel hampered by whatever regulations were being instituted, and that without them, there would be more social harmony, and it's basically the trickle-down effect, with the idea that there would be some sort of public gain. I encourage you to look further into this if you're interested in these concepts. It is a continuing argument, and you will find vehement supporters on both sides of this. We're not going to get into what the current arguments are at this point, but I did want to present these topics for you, what these terms meant at this point in the late 1700s, and you could see how they've evolved over time. Within all of this talk of this newfound liberty, and with all of these problems that started to arise, you also start to see the limits of this newfound liberty. So we talked a little bit last week about loyalists who had been loyal to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War. This was anywhere from a fifth to a quarter of free Americans, meaning not enslaved people. So that totals out to about 20,000 who fought within the war. Now, certainly there were many people who were loyalists who were not participating directly in the war and were either within the governmental structure or personally felt that way, but didn't fight. Many of the people who were sort of pinned as loyalists had been connected to the monarchy in some financial way. Oftentimes they were lawyers, merchants, and imperial officials. They were often fearful of the power of the people. They thought facing open rebellion by the people would mean that they would live in some sort of anarchy and would be kicked out. You can see in the top picture here, you have someone being tarred and feathered. And these sorts of things did actually happen to people who had been loyal to the Brits during the war. About 60,000 loyalists were banished from the United States at this point, or they moved to Canada, which was under British control, Britain, or the British West Indies. Others who remained, as we just talked about, were attacked physically, and many of them had their property attacked as well. So they suffered financial ruin for having been loyal to the British Crown. The end of the war brought this statement in the Treaty of Paris that the loyalists would be left alone. So at that point, it made it illegal to do things against these loyalists, but many people still assaulted the loyalists, and hence why so many of them moved outside of the country. They felt they couldn't live next to the people that they had fought against at that point. Native Americans continued to see limitations on their freedom. There were many treaties that were put into place, but the fact that they were broken over and over again becomes a common trope that we'll keep coming back to. By 1790, there were about 200,000 Native Americans east of the Mississippi River, so within what it was now the United States. And they weren't necessarily a united front. We talked about how enslaved people brought over from Africa were also not this united front. Many of them didn't speak the same language. They did not have the same culture. It's the same thing with different tribal groups. They had many split allegiances, and many people sided with the Brits, many people sided with the newfound Americans, many people sided with neither of them and wanted sort of a pan-Indian movement, as we talked about before, where different tribes would make agreements with each other because they found themselves to be more similar than they did to the Europeans. And they thought that if they could get together and fight together against European encroachment, they wouldn't have to keep moving west or be slaughtered in the process. It's also at this point where you start to see state-sanctioned slaughter or genocide against Native Americans in order to free up more land. There were different governmental structures that were allowing people, or even paying people sometimes, to go out and kill people, kill Native Americans who were living on particular land tracts that the state wanted to expand into. Following the Revolution, the word freedom entered Native American languages or lexicons. They hadn't, up until that point, had to worry about trying to ensure that they had it until European arrival had them suffering and sort of needing to either stand their ground or move on. They were oftentimes also enslaved, as we discussed. So this idea of freedom started to become a rallying cry for Native Americans throughout the Pan-Indian movement and within particular tribes that remained separate. And to show part of this variation in experience, we have a drawing here of Thayendanegea, who was also known as Joseph Brant, and he served in the British Army as an interpreter of native languages during the Revolutionary War. So it would be beneficial to have people translating, as there often had been. We talked about Pocahontas as being this sort of go-between, and many different people were hired on as translators to make communication between potential enemies or potential allies much easier. I feel like a dinosaur meme is always a little bit helpful. Says America wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War for independence without slavery driving the economy. So this seems to be the epitome of hypocrisy that we've been talking about basically since the beginning of this semester, and it will keep coming up until the end of this semester. So slavery and the Revolution. Slavery continued after the Revolutionary War, and in 1776 there were about 500,000, so 500,000 enslaved people, which was about a fifth of the population of the United States. So 20% of the population was enslaved at the time of the Revolutionary War. There was a popular notion that people would often label a tyrannical government as slavery, or women had been using the term slavery to describe their marriages, which may have been closer to the truth with some marriages, but there were a rising number of companionate marriages at this point, and it wasn't the majority that were being treated poorly, even if the laws were not open to them at this point. So there's this continuing misuse of the word slavery. Keep seeing that throughout the centuries. You even have it these days where people are in fact being paid something, and it's not the same as chattel slavery, although it's not good. All of the cries for freedom that people were talking about, many of them were actually oppressed. It's just that they weren't being held in slavery, so it's an inaccurate term. It's a term that applies to a particular set of circumstances, and those circumstances still exist today for many people. So by calling a low-paying job slavery, it's being a little disingenuous about the situation for many people who are actually completely unpaid and forced to do physical labor throughout the world, including in the United States. It's obviously not legal in the United States, and it's not legal within many of the countries in which it happens. One quote from the Give Me Liberty book is that slavery for blacks made freedom possible for whites. This idea is that whites would be reduced to slavery if the black slaves were taken from them. That was the idea that people continued to throw over and over and over again, that they would not have enough money to pay somebody to do the work that the enslaved people were doing for them, and then that would relegate them to that bottom rung instead. This is the argument that people who owned enslaved people would often put forward, with the hopes that those in charge would not want to see white men becoming slaves, as they had done away with indentured servitude prior to this. One thing that happened during the Revolution was that South Carolina and Georgia promised each white volunteer an African slave following the end of the war, should they win. This was an attempt to have people join the cause. They had lower numbers of people joining from these states. There was less of a white population from the southern states. There was also, on the other side of this, a rise in abolitionist sentiment. So abolitionism being the idea that the concept of slavery, the structure of slavery should end, and all people should be legally free. It does not necessarily mean at this point that most of them believed that all free people should be equal necessarily. There was a lot of conversation about what rights African men would be afforded were they to become free, and if they would have a separate set of rights. We obviously know what happens, but we'll continue to talk about the evolution of that structure throughout this semester. But on the other side of this sort of interest in maintaining slavery, you also have an interest in abolishing it. In the 1770s, there were freedom petitions brought to New England courts from African slaves. You'll read one in Voices of Freedom. And these petitions were oftentimes using the same set of words and the same language to evoke the same sort of emotions that were being used throughout the Revolution. So they were using the same terminology that the Americans were using to gain their freedom from England, and saying, we too deserve these universal rights. Throughout the war, about 100,000 enslaved people defected for Britain for freedom. As I told you last week, if enslaved people decided to fight for the British, they would be guaranteed their freedom. And as we discussed a couple of slides ago, Vermont banned slavery in 1777 when they were setting up their own state constitution. It's also at this point that people started to see this gray area within slavery. So some states and some people decided at this point to free the next generation of enslaved people, but not those who were currently enslaved. So if they had children, sometimes they wouldn't be brought into this system of slavery and instead would be born free, but the person having the child, their parent, would remain an enslaved person. Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved woman in a wealthy home in Boston, and she had been brought to what became the United States across the Atlantic in that Middle Passage that we've discussed as a 7-year-old girl. She was educated in that home in Boston against all legal structures at that point, because it was illegal still to teach an enslaved person to read or write. So she was educated in secret, and she found her talent as a poet, and eventually she was published. The publication of her work hinged upon whoever could vouch for her. So the white owners essentially would need to say that it was indeed her writing these poems, and that she could be somehow esteemed and trusted. So Phyllis couldn't necessarily make this legitimate on her own. She required someone else to come in and suggest that she was indeed a legitimate writer, and that they had witnessed her doing this, basically. We included a short poem here that she wrote on being brought from Africa to America. There was a writing by an enslaved person in Voices of Freedom last week that a lot of people were interested in. So these are, again, firsthand accounts of how somebody felt about this. And she said, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." So she has sort of this different idea than we heard from Equiano last week, and she's suggesting that she's somehow been improved in this process, but also she's noting that she's been sort of left out. She's acknowledging her status as an enslaved woman, and she's acknowledging that the whites that she's living with in society are looking at them as lesser than, and she's feeling that she needs to make the point that she can write these beautiful poems, she can write about religion, she can write about complicated issues, and that she could become a useful part of society other than an enslaved person. And at this point, we talked about how Native Americans, African Americans, and women in general, including women within those groups, were reacting and asking for an increased access to government and to be able to experience freedom in the way that those who fought in the war were suggesting people should be able to have. So women were often involved in street actions and the boycotts leading up to the war. They were also disseminators of information. So they were making pamphlets, they were writing, they were having speeches while men were away, and attempting to convince people of a particular side. Deborah Sampson is famous for having enlisted in the Continental Army. She disguised herself as a man in order to get in. It was not until quite recently that women were allowed to join combat units, and it's still relatively recent that women were allowed to join the armed forces anyway, but basically every American war, there have been women who have made their way in, including into combat units. There were women serving in all sorts of different jobs throughout the armed forces, but there have essentially always been some women in combat who either snuck in or ended up in combat based on their positioning. What happened was she pulled a bullet out of her own leg to avoid a doctor discovering her biological sex. It's said that some of the men around her did indeed know that she was a woman, but they didn't care because she was doing her job, which is something that you often hear soldiers saying today. If people can do their job and they're up to snuff, then they don't particularly care. And obviously that's not a common story for the Revolutionary War. Most, as we mentioned, were working in the information machine and doing boycotts, and they were also creating associations that collected money for the war so that they could buy supplies. The coverture laws remained intact and politics were still off limits. We talked about coverture before as being the legal status of women being subservient to either their father or their husband. Duty and obligation were often the terms that came up when discussing what wives and mothers would be doing for this newfound republic. Freedom was sort of designated as this male term, where duty and obligation to the country, to hold it up, to make sure it was functioning correctly, to make sure that people were provided for, those were the sorts of words that were applied to women's work. Republican motherhood is one example of that, in that women were deemed as important for training the next generation on how to be virtuous. So they would require more education in order to be successful at training their children in what needed to be done. If they were going to educate their own children, they also needed to be educated. So they started to see this limited access to education for themselves. Compassionate or companionate marriage is a voluntary marriage based on mutual affection and dependency. So this is not an arranged marriage. It's not something we talked about when we talked about tobacco brides before. This is closer to what we think of when we think about romantic marriage within the United States at large. That's not to say there aren't still arranged marriages or that there aren't marriages of convenience, that sort of thing. But by and large, the cultural attitude within the United States at this point stems out of this beginning of compassionate marriage, companionate marriage. Abigail and John Adams are evidence of a companionate marriage at this point. And what's obvious between them is that John Adams often took Abigail Adams' opinion and thoughts into consideration and enjoyed talking with her. They found their discussions together worthwhile. She is famous for having spoken quite openly to him in a large series of letters. You could find these letters relatively easily online. I'll find a link so that you can connect to them if you want to read more of them. But she's known for having questioned slavery when cries of freedom were being thrown about so often at this point. She also is famous for having pointed out the obvious gap in women's and men's rights and freedoms. She's certainly not the only one to do either one of these things. It's that she's a relatively famous person. Her husband was a relatively famous person, and we have actual documentation of her seeing these things. I have examples on the next slide for you. So a couple paragraphs from a letter by Abigail Adams. She says, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So you can hear this language of the revolution embedded within her own words as well. We talked about the freedom petitions from African enslaved people using this sort of language as well. And you can see it clearly in her letter to her husband. And she's suggesting, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable than your ancestors. So she's acknowledging that there's been this long track of unfair laws that women were being held down within. And at the end of it, she's actually suggesting that women will band together and start their own rebellion should they not be included. We know that this is a long-winded fight, and we don't necessarily see a huge uprising at this point and a huge organized uprising, but there were certainly groups of women who did organize and began demanding the right to vote. As you know, they were counted and within the Electoral College votes that would come up. We'll talk more about that next week, but they were basically counted for political purposes but had no rights, and then had to abide by the laws without any say. So this is their version of representation or taxation, essentially, or potential punishment without representation. She goes on to say in the same letter that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. So she's suggesting that men are naturally brutish. So she does go further than we typically go in today's society. But she does also mention later that men of sense in all ages, which we'd like to think this is the majority of men now, but it was a less common thought at the time, that they abhor these customs which treat women only as vassals of their sex. So they don't they aren't necessarily in agreement that women should only be there to serve men. And she's suggesting that more people become closer to what they've created between the two of them, and that the husband was not a master as within the coverture laws, but instead a tender and endearing friend. Sort of this companionate marriage where they're a solid couple working together rather than one essentially serving as an unpaid employee. So we have the end of this chapter for this week. You'll see a few videos posted for you to watch, and you'll also be reading numbers 33, 34, and 36 out of Voices of Freedom, and you'll respond to one of those. In addition to this week's reading and videos, you also have the midterm, which is due by Friday, March 8th by the end of the day. And that means 11:59:59. I'll post more instructions and I'll email everybody about this. But following that, we'll have spring break. So you'll have a week off that you won't need to check in. You can if you want to. I'll be posting things, so they'll be available for you if you'd like to do them ahead of time. But beyond that, we will get back in touch about the midterm, and then eventually, after the break, we'll move on to Chapter 7, which is the founding of the nation. So we'll start talking about the structure that's set up to create